In the vast, lonely expanse of the Pacific, more than 2,000 miles from the coast of Chile, lies a tiny triangle of volcanic rock. It's one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. We know it as Easter Island. Its indigenous people call it Rapa Nui. And for centuries, we thought we knew its story, a grim fairy tale of obsession and ruin, a story of a people who, in their blind race to build giant stone heads, chopped down every last tree, sparking chaos, cannibalism, and their own collapse. It's a powerful narrative, a story of ecocide told in best-selling books and repeated in classrooms as a dark warning for all of humanity. But what if that story, the one we've all heard, is almost entirely wrong? What if the people of Rapa Nui weren't eco-villains, but brilliant innovators? Resilient survivors who built a sustainable society for centuries in one of the world's toughest environments. And what if their downfall wasn't suicide, but murder? New and overwhelming evidence reveals a far more complex and, frankly, more tragic story. A story not of self-destruction, but of a thriving culture crippled by forces that arrived on the sails of foreign ships. This is the real story of Rapa Nui. It's time to set the record straight. Let's start with the story that has captivated the world. It's a narrative so powerful, so neatly packaged, it's become a modern parable. Popularized most famously by scientist and author Jared Diamond, the story of Easter Island became the ultimate cautionary tale. As the legend goes, it all began around 800 or 900 AD, when a small group of Polynesian voyagers found a lush, subtropical paradise, an island covered in a forest of giant palms, teeming with life. Here, they made a new home. Their population boomed, but then, a fatal obsession took hold. The people of Rapa Nui, organized into competing clans, began carving the colossal statues we know as Moai. Hewn from the volcanic tuff of a single quarry, Rano Raraku, these giant figures were, according to the classic collapse theory, part of a runaway train of competitive mania. Each clan, driven by ego, demanded bigger statues to show off their power. The resources required were immense. The myth tells us that to move these multi-ton giants, the Rapa Nui needed ropes and countless logs for rollers and levers. To feed the growing army of carvers and movers, more land was cleared for farming, and so the great forest of Rapa Nui began to fall. Tree by tree, the islanders supposedly sacrificed their future for their vanity. According to this narrative, the consequences were as predictable as they were catastrophic. Without trees, the soil eroded. Without wood for new canoes, deep-sea fishing was impossible. Seabird populations were hunted to extinction. The society, which at its peak may have numbered 15,000 or more, began to starve. Clans turned on each other in brutal warfare. The statues, once symbols of power, were violently torn down. Society, the story concludes, descended into chaos and cannibalism, leaving a barren landscape and a shattered population by the time Europeans arrived on Easter Sunday, 1722. It's a terrifying story. It's a simple story. And for a world grappling with its own environmental crises, it was the perfect, horrifying metaphor, a lesson written in stone. But as compelling as it is, this story is collapsing under the weight of modern science. For decades, the Ecocide narrative was the dominant explanation, but the story was a little too perfect. It fit our modern fears so well that it raised a question. Were we seeing the Rapa Nui people for who they were, or just seeing a reflection of ourselves? The first cracks appeared in the island's own oral history. The descendants of the Rapa Nui people told stories passed down for generations. These stories spoke of ancestors, of clans, of spiritual power. They spoke of challenges, yes, but they did not speak of a grand, self-inflicted collapse before strange ships appeared on the horizon. They spoke of a different catastrophe, one that came from outside. Then the timeline started to look shaky. Radiocarbon dating became more precise. When researchers like Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo began re-examining archaeological sites, they found something startling. The scientific consensus now places the first arrival of Polynesians much later, around 1150 to 1200 AD. And the construction of Moai and their ceremonial platforms, the Ahu, didn't just stop around 1600 as the collapse story suggested. Evidence shows that building and maintaining these monuments continued right up to, and likely even after, the first European contact in 1722. This flew in the face of the idea that society had already collapsed in a wave of statue-toppling violence. How could a collapsed, starving society continue with the massive labor of carving and erecting their most sacred monuments? Early European accounts are limited, but the first Dutch visitors in 1722 and the Spanish in 1770 described a functioning society and statues that appeared to be in active use. It wasn't until Captain James Cook's visit in 1774 that a crisis was described, with some statues toppled. Something had clearly changed in those few years, but the evidence for a pre-contact collapse was looking thinner than ever. These inconsistencies prompted a new generation of scientists to ask a revolutionary question: what if there was no pre-contact collapse at all? A crucial pillar of the Ecocide story is a massive population boom followed by a catastrophic bust. The narrative needs a huge population, often estimated at 17,000 people or more, to explain the scale of deforestation and starvation. But where did these numbers come from? They were, for the most part, educated guesses. But recent, more scientific approaches are painting a very different picture. One of the most groundbreaking areas of research is the reanalysis of the island's agricultural capacity. A recent study in the journal Science Advances used high-resolution satellite imagery and machine learning to map out one of the Rapa Nui's key agricultural innovations, rock gardens. Previous estimates, which had misidentified natural lava flows as gardens, suggested they could support huge populations. The new, more accurate analysis found the area of rock gardening was much smaller, capable of supporting a population of only around 3,000 to 4,000 people when combined with marine resources. This number aligns perfectly with what the first European visitors recorded. When Jacob Roggeveen arrived in 1722, he estimated a population of around 3,000. It wasn't the shattered remnant of a fallen civilization. It may have been the island's population at its sustainable peak. This conclusion is powerfully supported by genetics. Recent analysis of ancient Rapa Nui genomes looked for the genetic bottleneck that a massive population crash would have left in their DNA. The researchers found no such thing. Instead, the DNA points to a small founding population that remained relatively stable right up until the devastating events of the 19th century. There was no massive pre-contact population boom and bust. Instead, the evidence now points to a small, stable, and resilient population that successfully managed their island's resources for centuries. This wasn't a story of massive numbers and societal failure. It was a story of a few thousand people who knew their island intimately and made it home. The foundation of the Ecocide myth was crumbling. The central crime in the Ecocide narrative is the destruction of the Great Palm Forest. The image of the last tree falling is the climax of the cautionary tale. But was it really that simple? There's no doubt the island was deforested. Pollen analysis clearly shows that a giant palm, Pascalococos disperta, once covered the island and then disappeared. Humans certainly played a role, using fire to clear land for farming. But laying the blame entirely at their feet ignores a much smaller, but far more numerous, culprit. When the first Polynesian voyagers arrived, they inadvertently brought stowaways, the Polynesian rat, Rattus exulans. For the rats, Rapa Nui was paradise. There were no natural predators, and everywhere there were the nuts of the giant palm trees. As archaeologist Carl Lipo puts it, palm nuts are rat candy. The rats went, for lack of a better word, bananas. Their population exploded. One model estimates that the rat population could have surged into the millions in just a few decades. And what do millions of rats do? They eat. And they particularly love seeds. Archaeological digs have found countless ancient palm nuts, and almost all of them have the telltale gnaw marks of rats. The rats devoured the seeds so thoroughly that they effectively stopped the next generation of palm trees from ever taking root. While humans were clearing some adult trees, the rats were waging a devastating war on the forest's ability to regenerate. Some studies even suggest the rats' impact was so profound it could have caused deforestation all on its own. Sediment analysis has shown that forest pollen began to decline before the evidence for widespread burning appears, suggesting the rats got a head start. On top of this, new research points to another powerful factor: climate change. Analysis of lake sediments suggests that around the 16th century, Rapa Nui was hit by significant climatic stress, with drier conditions linked to the global event known as the Little Ice Age. This would have put immense pressure on the palm forests, making them more vulnerable to both humans and rats. So, the picture of deforestation becomes far more complex. It wasn't a simple case of reckless humans. It was a perfect storm, a combination of human land clearing, a climate that was becoming harsher, and a plague of millions of tiny nut-loving rats. The Rapa Nui didn't mindlessly destroy their main resource. They were participants in a complex ecological change, one they would have to adapt to in order to survive. And adapt they did. The Ecocide story insists that after the trees were gone, the people starved. It paints a picture of a helpless population sliding into famine. The truth is the exact opposite. The Rapa Nui people weren't helpless victims. They were brilliant agricultural engineers who responded to a changing environment with incredible innovation. Faced with poor volcanic soils and a deforested landscape, they didn't collapse. They invented a new way to farm. Their most remarkable innovation was rock gardening or lithic mulching. It sounds strange. Why would you fill your garden with rocks? But the Rapa Nui understood their unique environment. They knew that on an island with porous volcanic soil, little rainfall, and constant wind, the biggest challenges were water and nutrients. Rocks were the solution. They would break up bedrock and scatter fist-sized stones across their fields. This layer of stone mulch was a masterpiece of sustainable engineering. It protected the soil from wind and sun, reducing erosion and evaporation. It acted like a sponge, allowing precious rainwater to filter into the soil instead of running off. The rocks also created a stable microclimate, absorbing the sun's heat during the day and radiating it back at night. And as the volcanic rocks slowly weathered, they released a steady stream of vital minerals like phosphorus and potassium directly into the soil, constantly refertilizing the gardens. This wasn't a society on the verge of starvation. This was a society that understood its environment so profoundly that it literally turned rocks into fertility. They transformed a significant portion of the island's arable land into a productive agricultural landscape. This is a story of resilience and deep ecological knowledge. The Rapa Nui didn't fail because they were poor environmental managers. They succeeded for centuries because they were brilliant ones. So if the Rapa Nui weren't in a mad competitive frenzy, why did they carve and erect nearly 1,000 moai? The old narrative sees the statues as a symptom of a sick culture. But new evidence suggests a purpose that is far more profound and deeply connected to their agricultural ingenuity. Archaeologists now believe the Moai were seen as the living faces of deified ancestors, Aringa Ora. They were conduits of spiritual energy, or mana, and crucially, their purpose may have been to ensure the continued fertility of the land. This isn't just a theory. A groundbreaking study led by Joanne Van Tilburg and Sarah Sherwood focused on 2 Moai left standing inside the main quarry of Rano Raraku. The team found something remarkable. The soil around the base of these statues was the richest and most fertile on the island. Their analysis revealed that the very act of quarrying the volcanic tuff created a constant supply of nutrient-rich debris. The quarry wasn't just an industrial site. It was a productive agricultural zone where they grew bananas, taro, and sweet potatoes. The researchers proposed that these Moai were intentionally left in the quarry to stand guard, their sacred presence believed to promote agricultural productivity. This reframes everything. The statues weren't the cause of an ecological disaster, they were part of the solution. They were spiritual insurance, monumental prayers in stone for the success of the gardens that sustained the people. Most Moai were placed on platforms around the island's perimeter, always facing inland, watching over their descendants and blessing the land. The Rapa Nui weren't destroying their environment to build statues. They were building statues to help their environment thrive. One of the most persistent questions is, how did they move them? The largest erected Moai was over 30 feet tall and weighed more than 80 tons. The Ecocide theory provided a simple, brutal answer. They rolled them on logs, destroying their forest. But if the Rapa Nui were such clever engineers, could there be another way? The island's oral traditions always held the answer. The elders said the statues didn't slide on logs. They said the statues walked. For years, researchers dismissed this, but archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo took it seriously. They looked at the statues found fallen along ancient roads, almost always face down going uphill and on their backs going downhill. This is inconsistent with log rolling, but perfectly consistent with a statue being rocked forward. Working with engineers, they put the theory to the test. With a concrete replica, they found that with just 3 ropes and a coordinated team, they could make the statue walk. By pulling on the ropes from side to side, they could rock the statue, which has a low center of gravity and a curved base, making it shuffle forward efficiently. This method required far fewer people and, crucially, very little wood. It transforms our image of the Rapa Nui people from brute force laborers to elegant engineers who understood physics. The walking statues aren't a myth. They are a testament to a scientific and spiritual brilliance we are only just beginning to appreciate. So we have a new picture of pre-contact Rapa Nui. Not a collapsed civilization, but a small, stable, and incredibly resilient society of a few thousand people. They were master agriculturalists, brilliant engineers, and survivors. For 500 years, from their arrival around 1200 AD to the early 1700s, they built a successful culture in total isolation. And then, that isolation was shattered. On April 5, 1722, Easter Sunday, the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen and his ships became the first Europeans to make recorded contact. They saw a largely treeless land, but also a population that seemed well-fed, with a community of about 3,000 people. Over the next few decades, other ships would follow, but these ships carried invisible weapons far deadlier than any cannon. They carried diseases to which the Rapa Nui, in their 5 centuries of isolation, had absolutely no immunity. It's impossible to know the exact toll of these early encounters, but introduced diseases would have silently begun to thin the population. The healthy, stable society was now facing a threat it couldn't see. But this was only the beginning. The real collapse of Rapa Nui was about to begin, and it wasn't a suicide. It was a slaughter. The popular story is a tragedy of self-destruction. The real story is a horror story of external violence. The single most devastating blow, from which their ancient culture would never fully recover, came in the 1860s. In December of 1862, Peruvian slave raiders descended on the island. Over several months, these blackbirders hunted down the Rapa Nui people, kidnapping men, women, and children to be sold as indentured servants in the guano mines of Peru. The raiders captured an estimated 1,000 to 1,500 people, roughly half of the island's remaining population. Among the captives were the island's king, his heir, and many of the Rongorongo experts, the last people who knew how to read the island's unique script. Most died quickly from disease and abuse. Eventually, due to international pressure, Peru agreed to repatriate the few survivors. But the tragedy was compounded. Of the 100 or so who began the journey home, only about 15 made it back to Rapa Nui alive. And they brought with them a final devastating plague, smallpox. The epidemic was an apocalypse. It tore through the non-immune population. Combined with tuberculosis, it annihilated what was left of Rapa Nui society. The social structure, the ancestral knowledge, the ancient rituals, it all dissolved in a wave of death. By 1877, a census was taken. Only 111 Rapa Nui people remained on the island. 111, from a resilient population of a few thousand down to just 111 individuals. This was the collapse of Easter Island. It wasn't ecocide, it wasn't hubris. It was the devastating impact of introduced diseases and the brutal violence of the slave trade. The story of Rapa Nui has been hijacked. For decades, the tragedy of its people has been twisted into a simplistic parable about environmental foolishness. Recent scholarship has increasingly criticized the ecocide theory as a colonial narrative. The idea that primitive people couldn't manage their own resources and destroyed themselves. The truth is, they managed their resources brilliantly. They weren't fools, they were innovators. They weren't agents of their own destruction, they were victims of the diseases and violence that so often followed European expansion. The story of Rapa Nui isn't about how societies choose to fail, it's a story about how a resilient society was tragically destroyed by outside forces. What does it mean that for so long, we preferred to believe the lie? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you believe these real stories deserve to be told, please consider subscribing. The true history of Rapa Nui is not a cautionary tale about ecocide. It's a profound story of human resilience. For centuries, a small group of people, isolated by the world's largest ocean, built a sustainable society. They understood their fragile home with an intimacy we are only just beginning to grasp. They turned rock into soil, made statues walk, and encoded their ancestral knowledge in the landscape itself. Their world did not end because they were reckless. Their world ended because our world came to them. The catastrophic depopulation of Rapa Nui in the 19th century is a stark reminder of the dark side of contact, a tragedy repeated across the globe. By letting go of the myth, we can restore to the Rapa Nui people their true history, not as a failed society to be pitied, but as a brilliant and enduring culture to be admired. Their descendants today are fighting to preserve their language and heritage, the living legacy of that incredible resilience. And we can learn a more valuable lesson. The story of Rapa Nui doesn't warn us of our own stupidity. It warns us of the dangers of telling simple stories about complex people. It shows that blaming the victims is easy, but understanding the intricate, often painful, truth of what really happened is much, much harder, and ultimately, far more important. The stone giants of Rapa Nui have stood watch for 1,000 years. It's about time we finally saw them, and the people who built them, clearly.